Hello and welcome to a murder before bed. Let's have our first sip, shall we? Sip. Well, trains and murders. There is something deliciously exciting about that combo, as long as you're not the one on the train. Long before Agatha Christie thrilled us with murder and mystery on the Orient Express, there was a first and very real murder on the railways. Now, it's a rather juicy tale to share, so make sure you've got a cup of something comforting and you snuggle into a comfy chair because I think you'll need it. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of a very unfortunate Thomas Briggs, who was a respectable senior bank clerk at Robarts, Curtis & Co. in London. Now, on a Saturday night, July the 9th, 1864, he dined with his niece in Peckham, and he headed home by boarding the North London Railway train from Fenchurch Street Station to Hackney. Now, he was travelling alone in a first-class compartment with no corridor access. So it's one of those ones where you enter the carriage, the first-class carriage, from the station platform. Now, it was a rather short journey, one he'd taken many times before, but it was to be his last. His train pulled into Hackney Station at approximately 9:45 p.m. and two bank clerks, also with first-class tickets, went to enter his compartment. What they found would haunt them forever. A bloodied handprint on the window, not to mention splattered all over the carriage and all over the seats. Inside the carriage was a walking stick, a leather bag and a black beaver hat, but no Thomas Briggs. Where was he? He was discovered shortly after 10 p.m. by the driver of an oncoming train, lying on the embankment between Bow and Victoria Park stations. Evidently, his attacker had flung him from the train. Now, it was noted the absence of his watch and chain. That pointed to a robbery as a motive, although a £5 note remained in his pocket, which was a considerable sum back in those days. Miraculously, he was still alive, despite being severely injured. He'd sustained multiple harsh blows to the head. Now, sadly, Thomas Briggs did not regain consciousness. He died the following night in his home in the care of his housekeeper. So the police would not have his help to solve this crime, and it was the very first murder on a train. We better have a sip. We've got some detective work to do. Sip. Inspector Richard Tanner of Scotland Yard's Detective Branch had a very difficult task ahead. There were significant challenges due to the lack of witnesses and the isolated nature of the first-class carriage. There were, however, some major clues, including that black beaver hat that was left behind. That bore the maker's name, T.H. Walker of Marylebone. On July the 11th, a jeweller named John Death, I'm not kidding, John Death, reported that a German man had exchanged a gold chain that was identified as belonging to Briggs. 7 days later, there was another major breakthrough. A cabman called Jonathan Matthews, so a cabbie, came forward. Now, it must be noted that he only came forward after a reward had been offered. He only came forward after a £300 reward had been offered. So Jonathan informed the police of his suspicions he held about a certain Franz Muller, a 24-year-old German tailor. Matthews reported that Muller had visited his home a week earlier and had presented a gold chain in a box from Death's shop to his daughter. He was courting his daughter. Now, Matthews also identified the black beaver hat that had been found left behind in the carriage as one he had purchased for Muller months earlier. And he provided a photograph of Muller, which was a crucial piece of evidence in that era where photography was rarely used in any investigations. Now, I have some sketches from British newspapers from their archive at the time, and this is what Franz Muller looked like. So the next one is of Thomas Briggs and presumably the very train that he was on. These are the sketches that appeared in the British newspapers at the time reporting on this crime. Now, the investigators learnt from Matthews that Muller had fled to New York on a sailing steamship, but undeterred, Inspector Richard Tanner and Sergeant Clark pursued him on a faster steamship. They arrived in New York City 3 weeks before him. And on August 25th, Muller was arrested in Manhattan. So they searched all his possessions and it revealed Briggs's gold watch and a hat that had been modified to disguise the fact that it had originally belonged to Thomas Briggs. It had been his top hat. Presumably, the person that fled the scene of the crime grabbed the wrong hat. Extradition proceedings began and Muller was finally returned to England on September the 3rd, and he was greeted by a really angry crowd at Euston Station. The evidence presented at trial was entirely circumstantial. So let's have a think about this. Entirely circumstantial evidence, seemingly no real motive, because like I said, if it was robbery, there was a £5 note left in the guy's pocket. Can you think of another likely suspect that I've presented to you so far? Think back a little bit. I have mentioned someone's name. I'll give you some thinking time while I have a sip. Now, Muller's defence lawyers really went to bat for him in the trial. They were very aware of all this circumstantial evidence, and they argued that the hat found at the scene of the crime might have belonged to a Mr. Jonathan Matthews. They argued he was unreliable due to his extensive criminal history, and they suggested that he could be the killer. I've got to say here, did you find the claim that he'd purchased a hat for Muller very, very strange? I mean, we know that Muller was courting his daughter, but who would purchase a hat for another man? It just seemed like such a strange thing to say. Muller maintained his innocence, claiming that he was with his girlfriend, Jonathan Matthews' daughter, at Camberwell at the time. He wasn't even at the scene of the crime. But the jury took just 15 minutes to convict him, to find him guilty. On November the 14th, 1864, Muller was publicly hanged outside Newgate Prison before a raucous, drunken crowd of approximately 50,000 people. They were so badly behaved, it led to the abolition of public executions within 4 years. Thank goodness for that. You just can't count on people to behave themselves at executions. So what do you think? Was an innocent man executed? It was reported at the time, maybe conveniently, and many do not believe it, that Muller had suddenly confessed to a German-speaking priest on the way to the gallows, and his confession was, and I quote, "I did it." So not very imaginative. Regardless, though, of who done it, the murder caused a national panic, and it amplified fears about travelling on trains, understandably, and also just in general about the safety of rail, especially travelling in unlit, non-corridor compartments. And the public outcry led to some significant changes. The installation of communication cords. These allowed passengers to alert train staff if they were getting murdered, which helped address the very isolation of the standalone compartments. And corridor carriages were introduced in the 1890s, so a fair time after this murder, which allowed movement between compartments, and that was seen to enhance safety. I mean, at least you could run away, get away. And a rather creepy initiative that was called Muller's Lights, where peepholes were drilled into the walls between compartments. So these are the compartments where you have to enter from the station platform. No corridor at this stage. So they just drilled peepholes from compartment to compartment. Now, understandably, these were really unpopular with some passengers because you could imagine that that would be even creepier. Imagine if you saw this eyes staring at you through the peephole from the carriage in front of you. I mean, it would be terrifying. The case inspired crime stories about railway dangers and provoked even more anxiety. So with all these made-up fictional murder stories on trains, people were getting quite hysterical about the whole thing. And it also exposed the limitations of early forensic policing. So while the circumstantial evidence against Muller was strong, many many had doubts about his guilt, including myself. Let me know down below what you think. Was Muller guilty, or do you think that Jonathan Matthews was a more likely candidate? It was a case that truly shocked Victorian Britain, and it did shock me. I think Muller was stitched up by Matthews. I do. I think he was. But like I said, let me know what you think down below. Thank you for joining me for Murder Before Bed. I'll share some of your comments in the next one so we can find out what everyone thinks, what everyone's theories are, because you are my armchair detectives. Sip. I look forward to seeing you again for another Murder Before Bed. Bye.